Hello, my name is Andrea, and our podcast is A Four-Way Perspective. The podcast is made up of Valeria, me, Brittany, and Cassandra. My name is Andrea. It's my second year at Cal State Fullerton, and I'm majoring in criminal justice.
Hello, my name is Cassandra Aguilera. I'm a second year, and right now I'm currently working towards a Bachelor's of Arts in Business Administration with a concentration in finance.
Hello, my name is Brittany and I'm 23 years old and I'm in the last year of getting my bachelor's in child and adolescent development.
Hi, my name is Valeria Ruiz. This is my third semester of my master's in Spanish. Now, for the first question, I'm going to ask Andrea, how and why did the examples of the podcast episodes that we listen to and study provide strategies, practices, and techniques that inform the creation of the group podcast?
Well, after listening to the podcast Turning Poison into Medicine, I was able to study strategies for when my group started our own podcast. One good example that I noticed right away was that Professor Mario Obando introduces his speakers before saying anything else. And soon after, he lets the listener know what the purpose of the podcast is. I also acknowledge that about at 3 minutes and 48 seconds, he shows how he cites another person's work. He introduces the author and then the work. For this case, it was an essay. Another example of how the podcast provides a good strategy was about 5 minutes to 5 minutes and 42 seconds when he transitions into a different topic. It was a good practice to listen to because our podcast touches on several different topics where we would need to transition. And Professor Mario Obando shows a good example of how to maneuver your way around it. One last example that I witnessed through the whole podcast was that the conversation between the speaker wasn't really script. It was more of a relaxed conversation where the listeners didn't feel pressured into the conversation. At least while I listened to it, it didn't feel like I was like they were reading off the script. It felt more like they were having a conversation one-on-one where they really got to share how it related to their life, or how when Professor Mario Bando asked anything, he was able to contribute to the question asked from his personal life or experience.
Right. I also noticed that like most of the episodes, they help me think about like our dialogues and the efficiency of it, because they touched upon how words are not only words themselves, their expressions, and they also detone like they should be done respectfully, and they can be perceived as a shared space in our learning where we can just engage, come together, come to a conclusion, formulate different ideas, and then also gain more knowledge. And it also caught to my attention that he said it's not like a competition of who's right or who's wrong. Is the purpose of this is to grow as a community, to gain different perspectives, and to also feel safe where we're sharing.
It is also good too, like how it's like pretty much a conversation between all the people in the podcast, and it gives us given information so we can learn about other people's opinions about what's going on in today's world.
I agree with you that it's more like about conversation. I see that he provides evidence, but at the same time, he relates that evidence to like something that he experienced in his life or a friend, like more personal stories that can tell and relate to that topic.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Valeria. Throughout the podcast, I also noticed how it's not just him citing like evidence for like the listener to know, but more of contributing to the evidence and explaining how the evidence develops. Now that I have emphasized what a good podcast should consider, let's begin to examine the activist movements from this unit and how they relate to Unit 2. Cassandra is taking over segment 2. For segment 2, Cassandra, specifically to you, how did the activists that we studied from Unit 3 respond to the histories and legacies that we impact in Unit 1 and 2?
Hello. Okay, so for this segment, I'm focusing on the activists that we have studied in Unit 3 as a response to the histories and legacies that we have unpacked in Unit 1 and 2. In fact, all these activists have in common the trait where they all have gone through hardships and challenges that hurt them overall in their community and even got part of their members killed. And a lot of this suffering and injustices went on in order to take action, make a difference, and change history. For example, and my first example is Grace Lee's experience and accomplishments as an activist, since she stemmed from an African American community when she joined, organized, and empowered the Black Power movement. One of her examples of the evolution was the Detroit Rebellion, in which African American communities stood up against injustices and mistreatment from the police. However, their activism never implied an incitation to violence, but the average of people led to multiple deaths, crimes, and looting. This unpacks history from Unit 1 and 2 since it shows how similar as African Americans, Indigenous people, slaves, Chinese, Japanese, and Mexican immigrants suffer and fought against unfair treatment and discrimination from society and those in power. It also displays how Indigenous communities, slaves, African Americans, and immigrants underwent a lot of injustices and spoke up um, against violence in order to achieve equality, protection, rights, and liberation. My second example is when Baldwin claims that white revolutionaries have been by far more romanticized than the Black Revolution, because the moment they decide to take action and justice in this is the same moment in which the whole nation turns against them and they are seen as a threat and receive dehumanizing treatment. In fact, the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King proves this point because they had the potentiality to create a change, and they just faced a lot of apathy, they faced terror, they faced violence and oppression because the whole overall African community was suffering due to racial hierarchy based on white supremacy. But also due to a negative experience in the search for justice, equality, like other communities and immigrants have suffered due to racialization. And for instance, historically, socially, economically, and politically, African Americans have always been victims of mistreatment, discrimination, and social inequalities. So connected to this is my third example where Baldwin states that a Black man who sees the world the way John Wayne, for example, sees it will not be eccentric patriot, but a raving maniac. So this again emphasized that African Americans have long fought for their rights, equality and change, but the results of such efforts still relies heavily on those in power, which are majority white or against this movement. So just like every effort of other minority of the members of the LGBTQ community, for example, they have been disregarded, which ties with my example number 4 about Marsh and Sylvia, the starting their political and action committee called STAR, the Street Travestis Action Revolutionaries, where people had a space to engage in the movement, commit, and help most vulnerable people in society. And it was intended to provide a shelter for those who were exposed, trying to survive, or didn't have a place to stay overnight. They were trying to reduce the number of trans people who died due to overdose, suicide, murder, or disappear. And just as in the first unit, we studied disabilities and the creation of Crip Camp, it was meant to be a safe place for everybody to build equality and express freely without stigmas and prejudices. So similar like these organizations, many other past communities and organizations came together to make a difference, achieve justice, and provide a safer society for future generations.
Cassandra, I definitely agree with what you said. I think that this unit of activism ties with uh, how Nelson was talking about disabilities, and we were able to see in Unit 1 how African Americans were treated, how disability caused African American to undergo slavery. And I think from this unit, from activism, we're able to see how much of rights they grew from that. But in reality, it wasn't much because they were still being treated the same, even though it seemed like they had rights. It was more like they had rights, but they were still somehow being treated unfairly. So that was definitely a good example that you brought up because I definitely connected with that for Unit 1 and Unit 3.
Right. I feel like a lot of these communities have a lot of suffering in common since their fighting started and stem from all the injustices they were receiving for a long time.
I liked how every one of Grace, Baldwin, Marsha, and Sylvia, they all made an impact in their own communities, and they all try to fight for equal rights for each one, such as the LGBTQ rights and the Black African American rights as well. So they all play their part in trying to fight their communities as well.
I agree with you, Cassandra, that that African American people suffer a lot, and we saw in Unit 1 how they were like worse treated than indigenous people. They were sold as slaves, and they were treated different because of their skin color. We also saw that they were less considered to be citizens because they were considered like, as we say, disabled people. And we can relate it to Unit 3 because they're still fighting for the African American rights, even if like big time have passed, the big time like gap between those events, and they're still fighting for the rights.
Exactly. And even though the whole slave trading and their whole Black movement happened years ago, it's still going on, like with the recent happening of Black Lives Matter and police brutality. I feel like these communities are still not exempt and not protective at all from violence and from unequal treatment. They still have a lot of work to do. You know, authorities and activism has not ended it, even though they have a great job and a lot of stuff has been done for these communities, is still not enough. So now that we have learned and analyzed the empowerment of our activists in Unit 3 to unpack the legacies of our history through Units 1 and 2, let's discuss some further information and disclosing the transformation of our communities. For instance, in our next segment, Brittany Orheels is gonna talk about activists transforming the communities. So for this third question, how did the complexities, contradictions, and ironies that were expressed in the life and times of the activists of color that we studied in Unit 3 transform their community activism across the lines of race, gender, and sexuality?
So this segment focuses on the complexities and contradictions and ironies that were expressed in the life that transformed the communities. There were a lot of complications during the activists trying to make their name across the world on their actions to their communities, such as the LGBTQ plus community and the African American community. For example, Grace Lee Boggs dealt with many complexities when fighting for African American rights. She became one of the most known activists for workers' rights. Her early exposure to class inequalities inspired her fight for workers' rights in relation to capitalism and racism. She prioritized the struggles of the Black community and advocated for change in having more Black representation and power in positions with elected officials or in the police force. The Black community was dealing with so much hatred for them where they had no one to defend them in their rights as Americans. Example 2, where James Baldwin made an impact in the Black community where he was very passionate about how intimate and structural racism is. An example in the video about him is how he explains how Black people do not automatically hate white people. He expressed in the film how he expressed social fears when he was in America and how he was treated because he was seen as a colored person in the streets. And during that time, colored persons were treated horribly if they were just walking down the street. Baldwin dealt with contradictions against the white people, which he had only saw the good in the whites were doing and did not see the bad part of it, which they were treating them poorly and they were hitting them in the streets for just being different color. When it ties to Marsha and Sylvia, they were activists during the LGBTQ plus rights, which they fought equal rights for the gay and transgender communities, which paid for the LGBTQ plus community. They both created a political community called STAR, which helped young individuals with places to be. They dealt with a lot of people against the rights of the community, such as dealing with a lot of racial discrimination and face discrimination in their workplace because of their sexuality, which that shouldn't be a problem for their sexuality. They should be who they are in the workplace. Many people during that time did not believe or had hatred towards people with different sexualities. Sylvia dealt with being booed off the stage during the gay parade event. This shows that how people are against how people with their sexuality, and which in reality it's still going on today. We're still dealing with that in our communities. A lot of people don't not like people like that, but it's a way that they need to accept on how that's how people are today. And it's part of a community that's stronger, is trying to have activists trying to fight for each rights.
I totally agree with you in each of your examples. One of the things that stood out to me also about Grace Lee was that even though she was not part of the African community, she still fought and joined their movements, and she was basically the head of the whole movement. And the irony that she experienced was that even though she wanted to help and she did not want to incite violence, she was building a brotherhood, you can say, and a lot of these people just saw each other as strangers since it incites to hate and wrongful ideas spreading throughout the communities.
Adding on to your comment, Cassandra, I think that the same thing happens when Marsha and Sylvia were fighting for the rights for the LGBTQ plus community. I feel like in the film they say that even though people were not part of that community, they were standing up for that community to have their own rights and to be treated fairly, because just like Brittany said, they were being hurt on the streets. They were just wanting to express themselves and being jumped or being hurt, being beaten when they just wanted to express how they feel. So I feel like the uh, community just came together to fight for what people really wanted to change. I feel like they got into a big community and they stood up for what they thought was right, even if government officials didn't want them to. And I feel like they got a lot of backlash from that because they didn't want to give them the rights. And I feel like they stood up for it and they were able to change.
Yeah, you're totally right. And like in connection with what you make about the race, gender, and sexuality, like there is always a feeling of connectedness, harmony, peace, and sympathy towards these movements. However, the division of society and disparities among other people in our nation sparks racial violence, discrimination, and segregations happening often.
I agree with you that even though like Grace Lee wasn't part of the Black community, she wants to speak up for those that couldn't do it. Like she wants to speak up for the Black people that were afraid that they can be killed or something like that because they were demanding their rights. So I think like when everybody gets together and fight for the same thing, it makes like more change. The only one race fighting for the rights.
Thank you guys for all your opinions. As we move on to the next segment, as we go into the next part of the podcast, I would like to focus on activists becoming role models for people these days in our society. As I introduce Valeria Ruz in her next segment, changes throughout life experience. Valeria, I'm gonna ask you a question. How can we learn from the complex life's reflections and activism from Unit 3 and apply it to our current historical context?
This segment focuses on the activists that we study in Unit 3 and what society has learned from them. And these activists had the courage to change the way people think and having being role models for people these days. They tell us that we have to speak up in order to get justice and demand on rights. Also, they tell us that unity is the key to making a change. There is a lot of things that we can learn from those activists and their lives that we can apply these days. For example, from Grace Lee, we can learn how she supports the African community fight for the rights. Grace Lee showed that no matter what race we are, when someone of our minority communities are fighting for justice, we should help them because our ancestors suffered injustice in the past too. Lee showed that unity is a key when people want to make a change. We can relate the action deeds to the current present events because around a year ago, we saw how a lot of people got out in the streets to protest about the death of George Floyd, an African American in the hands of a police officer. Mexican American people and some other people that were indignated about the injustice came out on the streets demanding justice for this African American men. Another case where we saw many people getting together and protesting for justice too was the death of Vanessa Guillen, who was murdered in 2020 inside like the Fourth Hood in Texas. We saw that all Mexican community was helping her family to find her because they revealed the details of her death. Grace Lee teaches to be strong and speak up, as well as demand justice, because if we keep in silence, we will never have justice. Another thing we can learn from this activist is not to believe that all what we read on the books um, is true, because most of the educational books are written with a white supremacy. Bowen was an activist that spent time traveling from one place to another to observe how his race was treated. He observed to um, he observed and later he write books when or in newspaper telling the true events and the injustice that were being committed with his community. He was not afraid to write the truth. He just wanted the rest of the world to know what the United States government was doing and how they were treating them. Bowen was looked by the FBI after writing the cruel and violent attacks to the African community. This can relate to these days because we see how school educational books only tell one part of the stories, while other people that are still alive and were part of all those movements write the reality and what they lived during those moments. And thanks to the people, we can like discover the real things that happen, the real details, and the injustice made. So the reflection of this documentary is do not believe that all educational books say they don't go beyond slave segregated and revolutions. Classes like this one, that like Chicano study classes, show that it is true that we need to learn more about our ancestors and what they passed, the injustice they passed. Furthermore, activists mentioned Sylvia were two Black women who fought for the rights of gay and transgender people. I have to mention that they were even more violently treated than other Black people. Police attacked them more violently indirectly to them when someone from um, the transgender community did die. The police did not even make or try to help the family to make justice. In the documentary, we saw how the community did demanding where the community was demanding justice, but unfortunately the government didn't want to help. Victoria Cruz was the only one that wanted to help and study the case. Also, we have to say that we saw in the documentary that police didn't want to help because for them, those transgender people were nobody, they were no person. They were not like anything. We can relate this to these days because we see how transgender people stop fighting for their rights. And even though today there is more members of this community, we can forget that they still have a risk of being attacked because of their sexuality, and they have less advantage because of that and because of the close-minded people that refuse to accept them. I believe that if more people get together and fight with them for their rights, we could make a bigger change in society.
Those are great points that you touch upon, Valeria. And I also really like how you said that books don't really present the whole reality of our history. They don't go beyond just stating simple facts of a certain period of time, but they do not emphasize all the suffering that these communities have to undergo. In fact, relating it to one of the podcasts from Professor Obando, he says that we should challenge the media and we should understand what information out there is real and what information out there is distorted. And that's also a part of being an activist. And us as like students and as a part of a minority, we should be able to understand this because we can make a great change and great empowerment, knowing what news to challenge, what social media can accomplish, and what also it can how it can affect different communities. Like due to COVID, a lot of Asian hate was going on, and it all sparked because of social media, because a lot of wrongful information was going around, and it was like fast media. You know that it started affecting a lot of different people, and people who does not know how to distinguish fake news and fake information or distorted information from this one can like potentially damage other people the for spreading miscommunication or misunderstandings.
Adding on to your comment, Cassandra, I feel like recently we've came together as a community only when certain bad events happen. For example, Valeria touches upon the Black Lives Matter movement. And I feel like that only started because the video started circulating how police brutality is actually happening. And I feel like many people are in denial to not want to comprehend that that's actually still a thing, that we need to shine light in order to make a change. I feel like this union of activists really opens up a new reality, especially seeing the times that we're living in and all of this is still happening. I feel like we should have already been past this and everybody should have already had gotten equal rights, and that they shouldn't have been able, they shouldn't have to be struggling as much as they are in order to make a change. For example, in the LGBTQ community, I feel like we should be able to learn to just let anybody express themselves however they want. I feel like we should bring a light to these type of situations, not only wait until like something bad happens or a bad moment occurs where it comes to light on social media or on media in general. I feel like textbooks don't really explain it, like you guys just commented on it. It doesn't really explain the details and the hurt that people go through as a community together or by themselves. I feel like that should definitely be more exposed out there. And I had no idea before taking this class how much people actually suffered throughout these times. So that should definitely be an eye-opening for other people as well that have no idea that this is still going on and the history behind it.
Yes, Valeria, you also make good points. I also like this class very opened my eyes a lot to what's going on in the world. And it opened everybody's eyes and how everybody was treated back then. Good thing we weren't in that time, and how difficult it would have been during that time. People were treated poorly. Even today, people are still dealing with African American rights and LGBTQ rights as well. So we're dealing with a lot, and there hasn't been that much of an impact going on today with their rights as Americans too. So we're dealing with like a lot of injustice and civil rights issues going on in today's society as well.
Now that we have emphasized what a podcast should look and how it should work, that we have talked about how these activists from Unit 3 were related to Unit 1 and 2, and how the adversities that they live in their lifetime made them create a change in society, we have to conclude this conversation.
Throughout our studying of race, gender, sexuality, and activism in our history, we have learned about the violence and injustices minorities face on a daily basis. We have completed many actions and movements resulting in painful fights, but necessary to change our society and accomplish a greater good. However, we still have a lot to continue to fight for and to be treated equally despite color, background, or preferences. Thank you so much for listening to our four-way segment.